think what he meant is that the book on the Parthenon was well received in Greece, considering that it didn't actually say the Elgin marble should go back home. Home. Well, you know what I mean. Okay. On the 30th of September 1899, Admiral George Dewey, the architect of the US victory in the Spanish-American War, was given a triumphal, inverted commas, parade through New York. He processed through the streets of the city with 35,000 of his troops, cheered on by a generously estimated 2 million Americans who were supposed to have lined the route. The occasion had plenty in common with its Roman ancestor. There was a chorus of songs in honour of the victors, though in this case sung by the spectators, not by the troops, and not, to judge by the press accounts, quite as scurrilous as their Roman equivalents. You'll remember that Roman soldiers in procession were supposed to sing ribald ditties about their general. Romans, lock up your wives, the bald adulterers back in town, as one of the songs about Julius Caesar went in 46 BC. We also have reports in 1899 of just that kind of rowdiness, drunkenness, and sub-criminal behaviour in the crowd that we must suspect for the Roman victory parade, but can't document very easily. Particularly triumphal, though, was the apparently semi-spontaneous gesture of a little girl in a pink dress, I don't think it can really have been spontaneous, who presented Admiral Dewey with a laurel wreath. And of course, there was the splendid triumphal arch, partly modelled, only partly, on the Roman Arch of Titus and erected in Madison Square, through which the troops marched, plus some circus elephants, apparently, but not Dewey himself. This didn't go down too well, actually, with the crowd, misunderstanding the role of the commemorative arch in the Roman ritual of triumph, because in Rome it was not something that the triumphing general marched through. One commentator at the time complained, what is the use of building a $40,000 arch if they didn't take Dewey through it? Or, as one recent writer put it, just as inaccurately, Dewey became the first victor in military history denied the right of passage through his own triumphal arch. There's plenty of triumphal language and plenty of triumphal trappings, very obviously here. But of course, even so, no serious historian would seriously claim that this ceremony lay directly within the Roman tradition of the triumph. This is not, we would say, an example of triumphal continuity. It is a self-conscious imitation or revival, a reappropriation of triumphal form and language within a quite different cultural context, one of the many knowing exploitations of the ancient Roman past in 19th century American culture. To oversimplify somewhat, it was a pretend triumph, the pretense being nicely embodied in the arch itself. It wasn't made of stone or even concrete, but of wood, plaster and straw. Within a couple of years, it was an eyesore, completely dilapidated, and despite some pipe dreams to convert it into more durable materials, no money was ever raised for the project. It was demolished 2 years after it had been erected in 1901. Some of the sculpture, including the huge quadriga, which incongruously pulled a ship and stood on top of the monument, some of the sculpture was carted off to an exhibition in Charleston, but then it too appears to have been destroyed or allowed to self-destruct, I suppose. We would categorise other modern triumphs in much the same way. Napoleon's great triumphal procession of the art seized from Italy into the Louvre was a loaded imitation of the ancient ceremony. If Napoleon presented himself as a Roman general, which sometimes he did, it was just that, a self-conscious presentation, spin or image making. Likewise, I guess, the spectacular procession to celebrate the African victories of Charles V in Rome in 1536. Devised by the learned Pope Paul III, Alessandro Farnese, this carefully followed what they then thought was the route of the ancient triumph, and in order to follow this route, they bulldozed numerous buildings of the contemporary modern city in the process. And the ceremony interwove Christian and pagan Roman imagery to present the victorious emperor as a kind of cross between Scipio Africanus and St. Paul. For us, the ceremony itself clearly falls somewhere between a reinvention of the triumph within the 16th century context and a scholarly imitation of it. But we're not always quite so sure. Go back to the 6th century AD in Constantinople, and the triumph, again in inverted commas, all these triumphs have been in inverted commas so far, and the triumph celebrated for Byzantine victories over the Vandals, at which was displayed as booty, so it was said, the very same Jewish spoils that had centuries earlier been carried in the procession of Vespasian and Titus. We've already seen the Arch of Titus and its reliefs this morning. Here we have, again, the menorah and the other spoils taken from the Temple of Jerusalem by the kind of proto-Flavian dynasts. They were carried here in procession in 71 AD. They were said later to have been seized by the Vandals from Rome and then recovered once again in Africa by the forces of Emperor Justinian for his new Rome, and displayed again in a different triumph 500 years later. Is this a case of direct continuity, then, this triumph in Byzantium with the old city of Rome, or was this too some form of second-order imitation? Was it an example of the living tradition of triumph embedded in Byzantine culture from its origins? Or was it, to put it crudely again, was it Justinian using, imitating, and appropriating the forms of the Roman triumph to demonstrate his own legitimate Romanness? In fact, for many students of the ancient ritual, as well as for the novelist Robert Graves in his book Count Belisarius, Justinian's triumph holds a special place in the history of the institution. Namely, it is the last proper, real Roman triumph. After a history stretching back in Roman myth at least to the 8th century BC, almost 1200 years later, the living Roman tradition of the triumph dies out. Every later triumph, so this argument would go, is in some sense a copy of the Roman triumph. I should say that there are numerous other candidates for the honour of being the last Roman triumph, and in some sense, obviously, it's an entirely artificial designation, but it's a designation that scholars working on the ancient triumph tend to play with. Now, for the rest of my time this afternoon, I want to reflect a little on some of the main points of this narrative, and on how the issues of continuity and change which it raises impact on our understanding of the Roman triumph in its various forms. But more importantly, in a way, I want to flip the coin and to explore how the Roman triumph impacts on our understanding of ritual and cultural continuity and change. I'm aware that in some ways that this might seem to be biting a hand that feeds me at this conference, but I still want to turn the spotlight for a bit, at least, on the very terms of the title that this symposium is taken, and to wonder how dangerous, as well as how useful, are the terms continuity and change, both of them. Now, there are big issues in the understanding of any ritual whatsoever here. And let me just highlight some of the main dilemmas which underlie what I'm going to say, even though I'm only explicitly going to discuss some of them, and that very briefly. The first is the question of in what sense does a ritual have a history? We are now so used to talking about, for example, trends in ancient triumphal celebrations. For example, the tendency towards greater display from the middle of the Republic on, the way that the ceremony developed from a modest procession celebrating a modest general parading a small herd of cattle that he'd captured off some neighbouring enemy tribe, to the dynastic extravaganzas of the far from modest world conquerors of the later Republic displaying in Rome wealth beyond imagining. We are so used to delineating these historical trends that we rarely stop to wonder about the historical assumptions that encourage us to link the dots of these discrete ceremonies into a joined-up history of the triumph. That's also in inverted commas, to make all ceremonies part of the same series. One of those assumptions is, of course, based on the fact that that is exactly what the Romans did, some Romans did. Famously, Augustus had, rather murky slide, I'm afraid, famously Augustus had a list of triumphing generals inscribed in the Roman Forum. It's now in the Capitoline Museums. But that list itself had a heavily loaded ideological agenda driving it. This list, inscribed somewhere in the Forum, we don't know exactly where, was carefully laid out to ensure that the name of the last ordinary general to triumph, before Augustus closed the ceremony to all but the imperial family, to ensure that his name comes at the very bottom of the final slab, with no room for more names. This was, in other words, not a simple exercise of record, and of course no exercise of record ever is a simple exercise of record, but an attempt to turn the Republican triumph into an institution with a history and, of course, with an end. Those issues of how you, and under what legitimacy you invent a history of a series of rituals, are clearly linked to a related question. Namely, to put it simply, how do we decide when to count a ritual or a ceremony as essentially the same as some other ritual or ceremony? What qualifies a ceremony to be included in a list of triumphs? Augustus's views, I should say, were somewhat different from ours on that one, and he included in his list triumphs that we would not include in our list of triumphs. More generally, what counts as continuity between one ceremony and the next? This is particularly pointed over a period as long as the one we're dealing with in just the Roman history of the triumph, never mind all these later things. For to highlight an old ritual conundrum, it is absolutely clear that if the triumph, or any other ceremony for that matter, were actually being celebrated in exactly the same way in 200 AD as it had been in 700 BC, it of course wouldn't be the same ceremony at all, but then it would be a nostalgic fossil with quite different significance from the earlier, apparently identical manifestation of itself. So continuity is not necessarily about identity, and that raises big issues for how we decide what continuity in a celebration is. What then are we looking for when we're looking for continuity? Well, that question is further complicated in the case of Rome by the Romans' own stress on their rigid ritual conservatism and their apparent insistence that rituals be done exactly as they always had been done in order to be legitimate and valid rituals, and to be repeated if they weren't done right. Now, most recent work has shown the ideological limits of that claim and has exposed the vast amount of radical change and innovation that took place at Rome under the convenient alibi of conservatism and tradition. And one common tactic by historians has been to invoke discontinuity in Roman ritual of a very particular kind. Since the work of Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger in the early 1980s, appeal has often been made to the notion of the invention of tradition and the way that societies actively invent fictional but useful continuities with the past, often precisely as a means of innovation. British culture provides the prime examples of this. As David Cannadine famously showed, most of the rituals of British royalty are in fact inventions of the 19th century. This is the coronation of our present Queen in Westminster Abbey, and this is her lovely coronation carriage, to which we shall come back at the very end. As I say, as Cannadine famously showed, most of the royal rituals in Britain are 19th century inventions, despite the fact that most of my countrymen assume that they go back deep into oldie England and back to St. John, King John at least. The same would be true of many of the other British oldie English traditions, Morris dancing, Maypole dancing, Shrove Tuesday, you name it. In fact, if you were to follow Cannadine, most British traditions were in fact invented in the 19th century and go further back than that. It leaves a bit open, I think, what happened in the 18th. Now, the Romans, too, as many of us have argued, were great inventors of tradition, giving a variety of key, albeit relatively recent, rituals a continuous history back to the foundation of the city. Harriet Flowers notably argued that, convincingly in my view, for the Spolia Opima, and various aspects of the triumph I've argued in my book are, in a sense, invented traditions. Now, it is, of course, important to insist that rituals did not necessarily have a history going as far back as the Romans said they did. But all the same, the invention of tradition is not quite the panacea that some scholars, me included, have treated it as. For a start, whether we are dealing with a tradition that really goes back to the earliest period of Rome, or of one that merely pretends to go back to the earliest period of Rome, for the ancient world, the evidence in most cases is likely to be the same. There's no evidential difference between an invented tradition and a really ancient tradition. Either way, later Roman authors will always insist that the ritual in question is early. It becomes then an ideological decision on our part whether we choose to believe them or not. But equally important, the argument that a particular tradition was an invented one shouldn't blind us to the fact that for most participants, its ancient continuity is an important aspect, albeit a symbolic one, of the ritual concerned. In the case of the British royalty, where actually unlike Rome we can really show that and how the rituals were really invented in the 19th century, in the case of the British royalty, most people still believe them to be a hoary antiquity, and it is part of the symbolic efficacy of those rituals that they are perceived in that way. Whether it's invented or not, in other words, we're dealing here with a continuity or an antiquity of the ritual as one aspect of its symbolic repertoire. I am ancient is part of what that ritual is saying, whether or not it is or not. And I shall be coming back to that idea later. Right, after laying out some of those bigger underlying issues, I want now to return to the triumph. And I'm not going to claim that it will solve those problems, but by looking at key points in the story of the triumph, we can see some of those problems in action and from that, I hope, nudge a little closer to some different ways of thinking about the whole idea of continuity and change in Roman ritual and beyond Roman ritual. I'm going to start with a very brief look back to the earliest phases of the triumph and the claimed derivation of the triumph from Etruscan ritual. Then I want to explore in more detail the claims of the triumph's continuity into late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, and to look a bit harder at the triumphal celebrations in Constantinople in 536 AD that I've already mentioned. Now, one of the biggest controversies, even now, and I say even now because you would have thought that by now people had given up the search for the origins of festivals, even now, one of the biggest controversies is where the triumph came from and what its parentage is. There are very few, some but very few, students of the ceremony who entirely reject some form of more or less direct inheritance from Rome's ancient neighbours, the Etruscans. I don't want to linger here on the question of what inheriting a ritual might mean exactly, though I think that's a big question. I want instead to look at one way that proposition is defended. For no Roman writer himself makes any such outright claim. No Roman writer says the triumph is inherited from Etruria. Rightly or wrongly, they see some triumphal symbols as Etruscan, but they do not ascribe the origins of the ceremony as a whole to Etruria. Much of the key evidence for modern scholars has been visual, Etruscan paintings and sculpture, which portrayed, it is claimed, the Etruscan ancestor of the Roman triumph. One of the most famous pieces of evidence comes from the so-called Francois tomb, and it reveals very simply some of the practical and methodological problems in tracing ritual history and continuity. And this is the point, this methodological point is the point of my raising it here. I don't want to linger on the origins issue. The Francois tomb, named after its original excavator, is a large multiple tomb, it's a reconstruction, in a necropolis near the Etruscan city of Vulci, dating in its original form to the 5th century BC. It is richly decorated, as you can see, and it includes this painting of a man who's named above him Vel Saties, who is usually assumed to be one of the occupants of the tomb. The standard interpretation of this, according to the standard modern story of the triumph, is that this figure is no less than an Etruscan triumph in general, and so a proof, or part of a proof, of the continuity between Etruscan ritual and Rome. True, he's not in a triumphal chariot, but he does wear a wreath, possibly a laurel wreath, and crucially, he also wears a purple cloak, elaborately decorated with dancing warriors. This, so the argument runs, is the toga picta, the painted toga, itself purple, said to be worn by the Roman general at his triumph, though never illustrated in Roman art. So far, so good. Except that this garment is not a toga, but a cloak, and there is nothing whatsoever to link it to any kind of victory ceremony, apart from the warrior figures on the fabric itself, and some military motifs, partly Homeric ones, in other places in the tomb. And a wreath he certainly is wearing, but whether it's actually a laurel wreath, and so possibly triumphal, is frankly anybody's guess. Now this is a simple visual example of one of the issues I just noted. By what criteria do we decide whether or not this is the same as the Roman toga picta, and so a reference to an Etruscan version of the triumph? By what criteria, in other words, do we decide whether this is a bona fide Etruscan antecedent of triumphal dress, no doubt Romanized into a toga in the Roman ceremonial context, or whether it's simply a nice, rather posh purple cloak, nothing to do with military victory whatsoever? Or more precisely, if it is similar to the Roman toga picta, how do we decide if that is a significant similarity in the history of the triumph. The truth is that many attempts to prove or deny continuity or sameness between rituals depend on perilous, irresolvable matching exercises such as this. Now, with that very simple point in mind, let's look again at the triumphal celebrations in Constantinople in 536 to mark the Byzantine victories over the Vandals in Africa. Was this a self-conscious imitation of Roman precedent, or part of a living triumphal tradition, even to follow Graves and others, the last real Roman triumph? This is much more complicated than the case of Vel Satiers, though it rests on essentially similar arguments. Numerous features of the ceremony of 536 appear to match up with earlier Roman triumphs. Not only is the prize piece of booty identical to that in the triumph of Titus and Vespasian, but there were similar displays of prisoners as in a Roman triumph. The Vandal king Gelimer in Byzantium was a stereotypical noble triumphal captive, and the contemporary historian Procopius emphasised the ceremony's direct descent from the Roman triumphs of earlier times. It was, for Procopius, a traditional triumph. Yet, on the other hand, there were a range of potentially significant differences. The whole thing was happening for a start in Constantinople, not Rome. It was a Christian ceremony with no traditional pagan sacrifice at the end, and some question mark hangs over who exactly was celebrating and being honoured by this triumph. Although Procopius treats it as a triumph of the successful general Belisarius, which is where Robert Graves comes in fact his description of the event has both Belisarius and King Gelimer, that is victor and victim together, prostrating themselves in front of the Emperor Justinian, and other accounts treat it actually as a triumph of the emperor, not of his general. It's not hard to guess how different views of this celebration have exploited these different features. For some, whether the last such celebration or not, it belongs at the heart of what we call the Roman triumph, even if adapted to new circumstances and a new religion, as, of course, you would expect of a living tradition, so the argument goes. This isn't the kind of fossil that I was alluding to earlier. For others, this is radically dislocated from the original triumph, new place, new faith, etc., and is merely, in a sense, quoting the ancient institution. It's a classic example, in other words, of the dilemma of what is to count in terms of ritual and ceremony as the same or as different. So is there any way out of this cul-de-sac, whether for the triumph itself or in the more general terms I was using earlier? I would like to finish by suggesting, very tentatively at least, a couple of ways forward which might encourage us to look differently at the very terms continuity and change that head this symposium. First way takes its cue from the account of Procopius. What is clear is that that is not, or not only, a description of the triumph of 536 in traditional Roman terms. More to the point, it's an account which, by its repeated insistence on the antiquity of the ceremony and on its accordance with ancient tradition, is going out of its way to claim and assert that we should see that ceremony in triumphal terms. It is not so much, in other words, that Procopius was describing the triumph of Belisarius, but by describing it as a triumph, he was attempting to make it one. Whatever actually went on in 536, and that of course is completely lost to us, the writer's vested interest was in inserting it into a Roman frame. What I'm saying here is that we should perhaps not be so confident in seeing the terms continuity and change as analytical terms in some history of ritual, but should see them rather as discursive or interpretative strategies whose job is to create a way of seeing a festival. to attempt either to link rituals as part of a coherent historical narrative or distance them one from another with a contrasting appeal to rupture and discontinuity. For the modern observers, these are categorising devices, they're not descriptions. They police and periodise rituals for us. So, last real Roman triumph, everything later, somebody else's book, really. For the ancient observer or participant, they also make ideological claims of, about, and sometimes within the ritual. I stress within because I suggested earlier there are numerous cases, like the British coronation, when a confidence in the maybe fictional continuity of a ritual form is an important part of its symbolic power. Where we as modern observers mess up is in imagining that there is ever a claim about continuity or change that does not have a vested interest in somehow making itself true. My second point is more of a wild card, but it returns to the familiar opposition from which I started, the opposition between the traditional reception and the traditional repetition of a ritual and its later revival, the difference between the triumph, say, of Vespasian and Titus in 71 and Admiral Dewey's extravaganza in 1899. The question I want to ask is this: commonsensical as it may appear, does this opposition between real living tradition and revival hide as much as it reveals about the nature of change and traditionality in ritual? In a way, yes, it does hide things. For traditional practices, that's in inverted commas too, whether the Roman triumph or the medieval carnival, traditional practices are never quite as unself-aware as we non-traditionalists would like to make them. In the most traditional of Roman triumphal rituals, there is, I suspect, much more knowing imitation, much more of that looking over the shoulder at precedent, much more of the pretense, artifice and revivalism than we usually admit. There is, in other words, much more of the Dewey parade or Justinian's display in a real Roman triumph than that standard opposition between revival and original allows. Traditional ritual is always already looking at itself as a process of imitation. That, I'm sure, is one of the things that the Jewish historian Josephus hints when, in describing the triumph over his own countrymen in 71 AD, he appeals with no less enthusiasm and insistence than Procopius, and with no less of an agenda than Procopius, to the utter traditionality of Vespasian and Titus's proceedings. This is how the ceremony was always done, he repeats more than once. Even though the circumstances of this particular procession were extremely odd, and certainly not traditional at all. For Josephus's insistence on precedent and antique procedures makes a strange match with the fact, not mentioned by Josephus, that on this occasion, the traditional end point of the triumphal ceremony, the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline, was in complete ruins, having been burnt down in the civil wars just a couple of years earlier. Whatever happened at the end of the ceremony, the dazzling and rich procession reached its climax on a building site. How traditional is that? Now, that image of Vespasian's and Titus's traditional triumph ending up at a burnt-out ruin, still under reconstruction, calls nicely into question, I think, any confident notion of continuity and change. But to return finally to the modern world and to the ideas of pretense and imitation at the heart of all ritual, I just want to tell you one little story about the Queen's coronation that somehow sums this up. Now, I've already said that royal rituals are an amalgam of 19th century invention and our own contemporary confidence in their continuity from as far back as the British can possibly imagine. But I want to leave you with one final image of the pretense that is built into this continuous inverted ritual. You've already seen a picture a few slides back of that gold coronation carriage. In fact, an awful lot of gold carriages were needed in 1953 at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. The story is that the Royal Palace's carriage store didn't have enough. So what were they going to do to get more gold carriages for the minor royals and foreign dignitaries that also had to be processed to Westminster Abbey in a gold carriage? The story is, and I cannot authenticate this, but it's good enough, it's just a story. The story is that they had to hire them from theatrical prop makers and costumiers from the pantomime carriages that were used in Cinderella pantomimes at Christmas time. Now, whether or not that's true, it doesn't actually matter. The point is, what that story reinforces is the sense that at the heart of all this hoary traditionality, there is always this idea of the imitation and pretense of previous rituals, which in a sense isn't ever captured by our traditional divergence and schematic opposition between ideas of continuity on the one hand and change on the other. Thank you.